B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn sukkah Daf Zayin. We're going to start 3 lines from the bottom of Daf Vav Amud Beis. We saw in the previous Gemara a machlekes Tanoim. According to the Tanna Kamma, a kosher sukkah has 2 walls kahil choson, which means 2 walls that are the full length of a minimum size sukkah, that's at least 7 tefachim, and the 3rd wall is sufficient if it's a tefach. Reb Shimon said no. Reb Shimon said shalosh kil choson, I need 3 walls, v'revi'is afilu tefach, and the 4th one, that tefach suffices. So let's go now, just to make it easier, that we're going with the Tanna Kamma, shtayim kil choson, ushlishis afilu tefach, and now we're going to discuss that. V'oisoi tefach heichon ma'amidoi. So we know there's 2 walls, and a tefach as the 3rd wall. Where do you put this tefach? That this tefach in and of its own, we saw it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, but this tefach will comprise, so to speak, the 3rd wall. Because the Chachomim, the Tanna Kamma, say you need 3 walls. We learnt it from a pasuk before, basukas, basukas, basukos. 3 walls, just that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai said that the 3rd wall, it suffices if it's just a tefach. Where are you going to put this tefach in order that it will make up this wall? And we're going to have a number of explanations in the Gemara. Omar Rav says, Ma'amidoi keneged hayotza. And you'll see the diagrams in the Rashi here. If you have a right-angled 2 walls, let's assume at this point that it's talking about right-angled 2 walls, then on the edge of either of the 2 walls, that means not the point where they're joining, not at the opposite diagonal point, but one of the other 2 edges at the end of either of the 2 walls, that's called keneged hayotza, and you just put it there, the 4th wall, you put it adjacent, so to speak, as if it's a 3rd wall making a ches. Right? That means this tefach is going to be opposite the other wall. Just the other wall is a whole 7 tefachim long. This one is just 1 tefach. Omli Rav Kahana l'Ravasi. Rav Kahana commented l'Rav that according to Rav, v'yamidenu keneged roish tur. That why are you saying that you should put it right-angled to the long walls? Why don't you say that it's diagonal? That it should be on one of the corners, facing the opposite corner, the end of the other wall. And then it will look as if it's got 4 walls, because it will be, so to speak, if you were to continue this tefach right along, it's going to actually reach, if you put it diagonally, it's going to reach the corner of the other wall, and then it will be totally enclosed, and it's going to look like 4 walls. Shosik Rav did not respond to this. Rav didn't answer whether he accepted this or not. Itmar Nami, Omar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi, was also said in the name of Levi, Mamidoi keneged hayotza, the same as Rav said, that you put it right-angled on one of the corners. Levi said the same. And that's the halacha in the Beis HaMedrash. We rule that way, that Mamidoi keneged hayotza. So we've more or less had so far 1 stroke, 2 answers. It's keneged hayotza. The question is it diagonal or not? And Rav did not respond to that. And now the Gemara is going to give another opinion. Reb Simon v'item Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, one of them, Omar, said, Oise loy tefach soichek. Number 1, it's true, shlishis afilu tefach. But tefach could be, a tefach is made of 4 fingers breadths. 4 fingers could be held tight together, or it could be loose. And then the tefach is a little bit larger. And that means the minimum size tefach is 4 fingers pressed together. If the 4 fingers are loose, then it's actually a tefach plus. So Reb Simon or Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said that the tefach that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai said is the 3rd wall is a loose tefach, which means tefach plus a little bit. Oiselei tefach soichek, a loose tefach, umamidoi bepochis mishloisha tvachim samuch l'doifen. You can see the diagram in the side of your Gemaras. You put this tefach soichek, this tefach plus board, and you put it away from the corner, from the edge of one of the other 2 walls. You put it less than 3 tvachim away. We know, we've learned previously, that a gap of less than 3 tvachim is perceived as if it's filled. So that's called lovud. So if you've got just under 3 tvachim between the edge of the long wall and this plank of a tefach plus, together with the tefach plus, you've got altogether 4 tvachim. So v'chol pochos mishleisha samuch l'doifen, the 3 tvachim between this tefach soichak and the wall is kolov udomi. It's as if it's full, and if it's full, it's got a status of a mechitza of 4 tvachim, and that is it's a majority of the minimum size sukkah of 7 tvachim. So position this 1 tefach plus in a way that with lavud it will make up most of the minimum sized wall, and that's what the halacha l'Moshe Sinai meant when it said shlishis afilu tefach. Continues the Gemara. Omer of Yehuda. Sukkah ha'asuya k'movui. Till now we were talking about that the shtayim kel choson, the 2 regular walls, were long walls right angled to each other. What happens if you have a sukkah which is like an alleyway? It's 2 walls, one opposite each other, one on the right, one on the left, and nothing joining these 2 walls. Then the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ksheira, it's kosher, but you need a 3rd wall. Shlishis afilu tefach. Where are you going to put this shlishis? V'oisoi tefach, ma'amid this tefach soichak, this little bit wider tefach, ma'amidoi lekol ruach sheyirtze. You've got now 4 corners. When you have the 2 walls that are right angled, you only have 2 corners with close to which you can put the tefach soichak and make a, so to speak, wall of 4 tvachim. Over here you've got 4 corners because you have 2 walls not adjacent to each other, and from any of those 4 corners, just under 3 tvachim away, you put this board of just over a tefach, you have 4 tvachim, and it's kosher. Which means that Rav Yehuda held that even in a sukkah osui k'movui, a sukkah with 2 walls opposite each other, not right angled to each other, even there it suffices with just 1 tefach soichak. Reb Simon v'Tem Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi Omar, they argue. Either Reb Simon or Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi argues with Rav Yehuda and says no. Oiseloi pas arba. You need to take a board of 4 tvachim, umashu, 4 and a bit, umamidoi b'pa'ochos mishloisha, and stand it less than 3 tvachim away from one of the 4 corners. Samuch l'doifen, v'chol poches mishloisha samuch l'doifen k'lovud domi, and whenever you have a gap of less than 3 tvachim, it's as if it's attached. And then you have, for all intents and purposes, you have a wall of 7 tvachim, which is the size of a minimum sized wall of a sukkah. Asks the Gemara, why if the first 2 walls are right angled, you say it's enough to have the 3rd wall being a tefach plus, but if the first 2 walls are just opposite each other, the ka'omras that you said, boya pas arba, you need to have a board of 4 tvachim, a tefach plus is not enough. Answers the Gemara, hasam de'ikar shtei tfanois kahil chason. In the case where you have 2 right-angled walls, we say 2 walls are right-angled, it's good enough that we can now have just a single tefach with a lavud. But in the case of the 2 walls opposite each other, you haven't got 2 walls which are attached to each other. If you've got a board of 4, which is less than 3 away, a board of 4 plus, which is less than 3 tvachim away, so you have 7 in, then it can comprise a wall. But if not, then it cannot, and the sukkah is possible. So we had a machlekes here whether a sukkah, osi k'movui, whether a tefach suffices, which is what Rav Yehuda said, or Rav Simon or Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi will say you need a 4 tvachim board. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rava, ve'eino niteres elo b'tzuras haPesach. Rava seems to say that when it says shlishis afilu tefach, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that you put the tefach anywhere. What it means is you take a tefach, so to speak, you cut it into 2. You have 2 poles now of half a tefach each. And you make a tzuras haPesach, which a tzuras haPesach is the form of a opening, of a door. Which means, what's a door? An upright, a doorpost, so to speak, an upright on one side, an upright on the other side, and across the top is going a beam, or a thread. It can be anything. We'll learn about Tzuras HaPesach, but you just make a Tzuras HaPesach. We discussed this in Eruvin Daf Yud Aleph even more. So Rava says in this version of Rava, what does it mean, Shlishis Afelu Tefach? It means that on the 4th wall, on the 3rd side, you take 1 pole and you put it adjacent to the edge of one of the two walls. And then you go straight to the corner diagonal to the point where the first two walls meet. We're now talking about a sukkah which is a regular sukkah, which is a right-angled walls. So you start to put half a tefach pole at the end of one of the walls. The other half a tefach at the point diagonally opposite where the two walls meet. And then in between the two, and you make now a tzuras HaPesach, you put a beam or a cross on top of it, and then you have a tzuras HaPesach. And that is how Rava said you have to do the shlishis afilu tefach. Iked Omra. There was another version of Rava, that Rava actually says, V'niteres nami b'tzuras HaPesach. Rava wasn't saying that tefach means you have to make a tzuras HaPesach. No, you can either have tefach soichak, like we said before, with a tefach plus less than 3 tvachim away from the corner, and that's okay, as we saw before. Or you could have it, instead of that, you could have a tzuras HaPesach, one or the other. And according to this version, the tzuras HaPesach, the uprights of the tzuras HaPesach, don't need to be as wide as half a tefach, as we saw in the first version. The first version says that the tefach itself makes up the two posts, which means that each post is about half a tefach, which is very unusual. Normally, the uprights of a tzuras HaPesach don't need to have any particular width. So over here, we saw it does. And it's a discussion, why over here should you need that, and normally tzuras HaPesach not, but that's a discussion elsewhere. But according to this version, that you can use either tefach soichak or tzuras HaPesach, it's a regular tzuras HaPesach, that the upright can be as thin as you want. Iked Omra Omar Rava, a third version of Rava, utzricha nami tzuras HaPesach. What Rava actually meant was that besides for the tefach soichak, which you put just less than 3 tvachim from the edge of one of the two walls, you also put a tzuras HaPesach between this tefach and the virtual corner, that means, and the point diagonally across where the two walls meet. You put tzuras HaPesach there, and now you've got a third wall, which is part of it is pas arba with lavud. Part of it is tzuras HaPesach. That's what the third wall, that's shlishis afilu tefach. That's the third opinion of Rava. Continues the Gemara. Rav Ashi Ashkechel Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi saw that Rav Kahana ovid tefach. He made also this tefach soichak, v'ka ovid tzuras HaPesach, and he also, besides for the tefach soichak, he also put a tzuras HaPesach. Omar lei, Rav Ashi asked Rav Kahana, lo sovar mar lohad Omar Rava? Lohad Rava do Omar Rava v'niteres nami b'tzuras HaPesach? Did you not hear that Rava said that you can use either a tefach soichak or a tzuras HaPesach? Omar lei, Rav Kahana answered to Rav Ashi, Ano k'idach lishna de Rava svirali. I hold like the other version of Rava. The third opinion that we saw, third version of Rava, the Omar Rava, utzricha nami tzuras HaPesach. I hold like that version that says that Rava maintains you need also the tefach, also tzuras HaPesach. Continues the Gemara. Shtayim kilchoson v'chulu. We saw before on Daf Yomi Shiur, according to the Tanakama, there's two walls which are regular walls, let's say two right-angled walls, and the third wall, the Halacha L'Moshe Sinai dictates it's enough if it's just a tefach, and we've discussed in the Gemara how and where this tefach goes, but just a tefach. Now normally, in Hilchos Shabbos for example, what makes up a Reshus HaYochid? 3 proper walls. A ches, a wall on either side facing each other, and a wall between the two. 3 walls. That only then it's called an enclosure, it's called a Reshus HaYochid. So we see there's a certain leniency, and it's thanks to the Halacha L'Moshe Sinai by Sukkah that you can say the third wall, even though you only have a tefach, it's as if you have the third wall, even though there's no real third wall, there's just a tefach. Omar Rava. Rava says, V'chein l'Shabbos, which is a huge chiddush. Rava says that in the same way as we find the Halacha L'Moshe Sinai that dictates in the halachas of Sukkah, that the third wall of a tefach can be, so to speak, in place of a whole wall. So Shabbos also, and we'll see later, it's only talking about Shabbos on Sukkos, not every other Shabbos. On Shabbos of Sukkos, then in the same way that we can view this tefach as a wall in Hilchos Sukkah, we also view it as a wall in Hilchos Shabbos. Migu davidoifen le'inyan Sukkah, since it's considered a wall in Sukkah, have your doifen in Shabbos, it's also considered a wall in Hilchos Shabbos. Eisvei Abaya. Abaya asked on this, Mi omrin on migu? Do we hold of such a concept? He's asking against Rava, that you say migu, that since a wall is considered a wall in one context, it's also considered a wall in a different context, even though in and of its own, in that different context, it would not be considered a wall. For Tanya, this seems to be contrary to what we learned in a Brisa. Doifun sukkah kedoifun Shabbos. The general rule is that the walls of sukkah, the wall of Shabbos, are the same. What comprises a wall here comprises a wall there. Ubilvad, and over here, what the Gemara is actually talking about specifically is that we saw in Hilchas Shabbos that it's possible, one's allowed to have a wall of lovud, which means a wall which is completely made of horizontals, ropes, as long as there isn't a gap of 3 tvachim between the ground and the first rope and second rope, etc. As long as the gaps between the horizontals are not 3 tvachim, they're less than 3 tvachim, we use lovud and it's kosher. And for the same token, we can have just uprights, reeds, poles, wherever they are. If you have uprights that are making up a wall, as long as you don't have 3 tvachim between one upright and the next, it's a kosher wall. So we say that doifun sukkah is kedoifun Shabbos in the same way as lovud, either upright poles or horizontal strings can make up a wall, the same applies to sukkah. Ubilvad, but shelo yehei bein kono lechaveiroi shloisha tvachim. You have to make sure, and this is true also for Shabbos and also for sukkah, you have to make sure that you haven't got 3 tvachim gaps. If you have a gap of 3 tvachim, you don't have lovud anymore. V'yasera Shabbos al sukkah. There's a chumrah stringency regarding the walls of Shabbos that you don't find by sukkah. Why? Shahashabbos eino niteres elo b'oimid meruba al haporot. The walls on Shabbos, the enclosure on Shabbos is only considered an enclosure. That what's inside is considered a reshus hayachid, a private domain, only if the amount of uprights, which are more than lovud. That means if you have lovud, it's as if it's a gap. It's as if it's closed. But if you have, for example, 100 poles, 100 beams, 100 sticks that are making up your walls, and between some of them, between 2 and 3 of them, instead of having less than 3 tvachim, you've got more than 3 tvachim. That's okay. It's just an opening. An opening doesn't destroy a wall. It's not, if it's a Tzuras HaPesach, it's considered closed. If it's less than 3 tvachim, it's considered closed. But this is just an opening. The gap's too big. It's still kosher, provided that it's oimid meruba al haporot, that the total of the amount of area of the wall, which is considered closed, either Tzuras HaPesach or lovud, or just a solid wall, is more than the breaches inside, it's kosher. That's in Shabbos. Masha'en kein b'sukkah. Regarding sukkah, it doesn't have to be that way. Regarding sukkah, even if the openings, the breaches are more than the amount of closure, it's kosher. Because we said, shtayim kel chosam, you've got 2 regular walls. Shlishis, the third wall is just a tefach, and the rest of that third wall is open. And the 4th wall is open. And in the first 2 walls that are officially closed, 7 tvachim, if they have gaps inside them, then that's also okay. And if you want to add up all the amount of gaps that comprise this sukkah, which is kosher, you've got more breaches, more openings than closures. So what do we see from here? That in Hilchas Sukkah that's fine, in Hilchas Shabbos it's not, and it's called Yasera Shabbos. That there's a stringency of Shabbos. Why don't you say that in the same way that it's a kosher wall for Sukkah, Migu, to have a doifen in Sukkah, have your doifen in Shabbos. My love, Yasera Shabbos to Sukkah, a Sukkah. Do we not understand that what it means is that on Shabbos, on Sukkos, this won't be okay. It will not be considered a Yoshus HaYachid, even though the Sukkah will be a kosher Sukkah. And we don't say Migu. We don't say since it works for the Sukkah, it works for Shabbos. And then it's a contradiction to what Rava said, that you say such a Migu. Answers the Gemara Loi. What we meant is, Yasera Shabbos to Almal Shabbos to Sukkah. A regular Shabbos the whole year, you need to have Oimid Meruba al haporot. You can't have such breaches. But Shabbos on Sukkos, you can. Why? Since for Hilchas Sukkah, you don't need Oimid Meruba al haporot, Shabbos on Sukkah, you also don't need Oimid Meruba al haporot, exactly because Rava said, Migud have a doifen le'inyan Sukkah, have your doifen le'inyan Shabbos. So there's no contradiction from this brisa to Rava. Says the Gemara that if the way you're reading into this brisa is that Shabbos, a regular Shabbos, not a Sukkah Shabbos, has a stringency more than a Shabbos on Sukkah, because the Shabbos on Sukkah has a leniency because of the doifen of Sukkah. If so, listen, Nami, why don't you also say in the brisa, Yesera Sukkah de Alma, a Sukkah de Shabbos? There's a stringency of a regular Sukkah day over a Sukkah on Shabbos, because there's a leniency in the walls of Shabbos that you wouldn't find normally with the walls of Sukkah. And we'll say the same way as Rava said, that Migud have a doifen le'inyan Sukkah, have a doifen le'inyan Shabbos, we'll also say that Migud have a doifen le'inyan Shabbos, have a doifen le'inyan Sukkah. That on Shabbos of Sukkahs, since we have a leniency with the wall in Hilchas Shabbos, it will also comprise a wall in Hilchas Sukkah. Even though on a regular Sukkah day, which is not a Shabbos, we wouldn't have this. What would that case be? Listen, Nami, Yasera Sukkah de Alma, a Sukkah de Shabbos. De'ilu Sukkah de Alma, because a regular Sukkah day, boya tefach soichak. You need to have this third wall, which is a tefach. Ve'ilu Sukkah de Shabbos, but on as far as a regular Shabbos, and so too if we say migu, it will apply on Shabbos on Sukkos, loy boya tefach soichak. I don't need this third tefach, the third wall, to be a tefach. V'sagi belechi. It's good enough to just put up an upright pole. The ha'atu de omras, did you not say sikech al gabe movui? If you have a movui which is two walls opposite each other, and its opening is into the Rishus Harabim, you're only allowed to carry inside the movui if you put a lechi, which is an upright pole, as a sign at the beginning of the Movui to tell you you're not anymore in the Rishus Harabim, to differentiate between Rishus Harabim and Rishus HaYochid. And that pole can be any amount of width, even less than a tefach. So why don't you say that in the same way that Va'atu da'amra sikech al gaba movui sheyesh lo ilechi kosher? We said that if you have and we know this to be true, a regular movui, a lechi is good enough. That means on Hilchas Shabbos, to make a third wall, a lechi is enough. And if a lechi is enough for regular Shabbos, then it's going to be enough for Sukkah as well. So on a regular Sukkah day, which is not Shabbos, you can't use a lechi, an upright pole which is just a little, very, very narrow. But since it's Shabbos on Sukkahs, it's got that leniency that you don't have on a regular Sukkah day. And we're talking here about a sukkah which is like a movui. It's a sukkah kamovui, two walls opposite each other. And the fact that the Gemara said that on a regular sukkah day, lechi is not enough, you need to have a tefach soichak, which is interesting that, because we saw before it's actually a machloikas Rav Yehuda and Reb Simon or Reb Yeshua ben Levi, whether a sukkah ha'osui kamovui, whether you need tefach soichak or pasar bo. But here the Gemara is saying, even according to Rav Yehuda, who says that tefach soichak is enough, even by a sukkah ha'osui kamovui, that's going to be on a regular sukkah day. But on a Shabbos of sukkah, even just a very thin pole should be enough, like lechi. Says the Gemara, you're right. The Brisa didn't need to say it. Why? Because hashta mikilta lechamirta. If you said that, if Rava said his migu, that migu davadoifen linyan sukkah, if you said that shtayim kilchasa or shlishis afilu tefach, which is mutter, because of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, by sukkah, you say it's also okay by Shabbos, the halachas of Shabbos are much more stringent than the halachas of sukkah. And if you said that the migu says that anything kosher on sukkah is also going to be kosher on that Shabbos of sukkah, and it's considered a mechitza, a wall, even in Hilchas Shabbos, and you can use the area inside as if it's a Rishus HaYochid, then we take it for granted that Amrinon Michamirta Lekulta Lekolshkein. Of course, any wall that would be kosher in Hilchas Shabbos will also be kosher in Hilchas Sukkah on Shabbos of Sukkahs. And therefore the Brisa didn't need to say it. So far, what do we have? We have Rava, who said just one thing. He said that the shlishis afilu tefach, which is really a chiddush just in Hilchas Sukkah, and the whole year round on Shabbos, there's no such thing. You need a proper wall. However, in the Shabbos of Sukkah, since the tefach works to be a wall in Hilchas Sukkah, it also works to be a wall in Hilchas Shabbos. That was the migu of Rava. Now we're going to see another two halachas. Gufa Omar Rava. Now Rava is going to have two cases where you have a wall that on Shabbos is considered a kosher mechitza, and on Sukkos it's not. And in both of them, Rav is going to say that since it works on Shabbos, it also works on for Shabbos of Sukkos. That what? The first halacha that Rav brings here is that if you have a mavui, a typical mavui, is if you have at the entrance of the mavui just a lechi in Hilchas Shabbos, that's okay. The area inside the mavui is considered a reshus hayochid. It's a lechi. And it's okay in Hilchas Shabbos. So too, if you were to use it for a sukkah, as we saw this halacha before already, if you put schach on top of such a mavui, then now you want to turn this into a sukkah, even though the third wall doesn't have that tefach soichak or the pas arba that you needed. Nonetheless, since it's Shabbos of Sukkos, since it works in Hilchas Shabbos, it's also going to work for Hilchas Sukkah. Another halacha of Omar Rava, a second case where we find a leniency in Shabbos that will then spill over to Hilchas Sukkah for Shabbos of Sukkos. Sikech al gabe pasei birois. We learned about this when we were learning Eruvin, that there's a concept called pasei birois. There's a diagram in the Gemara here, which means the boards on the corners of the well. The area around the well was not a reshus hayochid. The well is a reshus hayochid. Carrying from the well to the area outside of it would be an issue on Shabbos. How are the animals going to drink? So they would put these posts up in the corner, that each edge of each of these right-angled posts was an amma wide, and then there was a special halacha that we look at it as if it's totally enclosed. In Hilchas Sukkah, this wouldn't really work. You need to have two proper walls. And shlishas afilu tefach, here you've just got these four corner posts. But nonetheless, says Rava, since it works in Hilchas Shabbos, it also works in Hilchas Sukkah. Sikech al gab, if you were to put schach on top of this whole area of these pasei birois, the al gabe pasei birois, ksheira, it's kosher. The sukkah is kosher. Why? Because migu, since it works in Hilchas Shabbos, it also works in Hilchas Sukkah. Why does Rava have to tell us both of these? Also lechi, also pasei birois, utzrich, I need them both. Diyoshmin on mavui, if it would only tell us by a mavui, that lechi, the side post of just a very thin post flash with the one of the walls, is already good enough to make a wall. Mishum de'ikashtei defanis ma'alias, over there I can understand that we should say that it also works in Hilchas Sukkah, because at least two of the walls of that mavui are proper walls. Avul gabe pasei birois, in the case of these posts on the side of the well, de'ikashtei defanis ma'alias, there's no two normal walls at all. Maybe you wouldn't say there that it works for Sukkah. Maybe it wouldn't work. If Rava would have only told us that putting schach on top of these posts across the whole area between these posts, it works, and would not have told us that lechi works, because at least over there's something that looks like four walls. But in case where you put schach on top of a mavui, the lekasham arbat fanis, you don't have four, you don't even have a representation of four walls for this sukkah. I may have thought, Meloi, you cannot use the lechi, and that's why I need to say it there as well. Now we have to get back to what we saw before. Here we have two halachas that say that migu, since it was a wall for Hilchas Shabbos, it's also a wall in Hilchas Sukkah. We saw before that Shtaim Kilchosa, Rava said the other way around, that any wall which is good enough for Hilchas Sukkah is also good enough for Hilchas Shabbos. The question is, why does Rava have to say this third halacha, that if it's good enough for Sukkah, it's also good enough for Shabbos? You already said here twice, Mavui by Lechi and Pasei Birois, that anything that's good for Shabbos is good for Sukkah. Answers the Gemara, if you would only tell us these two, I would have thought that only something that works for Shabbos can also work for Sukkah, because the halachas of Sukkah are much more lenient than the halachas of Shabbos. I may have thought that something that's good for sukkah, we won't say migu, we won't say it's good for Shabbos. I would have thought you don't say that. That's why Rav has to tell us that before we have to say no. Even in the case over there of shlishes afilu tefach, which works for sukkah, we do say migu, and we say since it works for sukkah, it also works for Shabbos. And obviously the question that the achreinim will ask here, so just say the halacha that migu, that it works for sukkah, it also works for Shabbos, just say that shlishes afilu tefach works for Shabbos, and I'll take it for granted that anything that works for Shabbos will also work for sukkah. And the achreinim discuss this at length. Continues the Gemara. This takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, that if the schach is got more sunlight coming through it than shade that it's offering, then the sukkah, the schach is as if it's no schach, and the sukkah is possible. Tanu Rabbanon, chamoso meruba, chamoso machmas schach, v'loi machmas tefanis. This is only true if the amount of light that's coming in is only consequent to the schach. If the schach in and of itself is allowing more light in, more sunlight than shade, then it's possible. Rabbi Yashi says, Af machmas tefanis. If in the sukkah itself there is more light, there's more light than shade, even though the light is coming in from underneath the schach, coming in from the walls, the breaches in the walls, and there also the walls themselves are not offering more shade than light, then the sukkah is possible. Omer of Yemer bar Shlamya mishmei Abaya, or said in the name of Abaya, my Talmud Rabbi Yashia. What would be the reason for Rabbi Yashia to say that the halachas of the walls, that means even walls, have to offer shade? Says the Gemara, it says in the pasuk, V'samta sham eis aroin ha'edus, you should put the aroin into the kodesh hakodoshim, v'sakoiso, and you should conceal, so to speak, a schach, you should cover al ha'aroin, over the aroin, esa pareiches, with the curtain. So we see here, this pareiches, mechitza, the curtain is a wall, it's not a covering. And it's called a covering, it's called schach. So you see that even a wall has the status of schach. And schach is only called schach if it's offering more shade than sunlight. And since the walls are considered schach, therefore the walls are also have to be tzilosa meruba michamosa, has to offer more shade than light. Alma, mechitza k'schach be'inon. We see that there's certain properties of schach that apply to the walls as well. V'rabonon, the Rabbanon who say that the halacha of chamosa meruba mitzilosa, the psul of chamosa meruba mitzilosa, is only with schach, not with the walls. Hahu de nechuf ba purta de merzik schach. Says over there, that wall, that curtain between the heichal and the kodesh hakedoshim was actually leaning a little bit over towards the inside of the kodesh hakedoshim. Since it was leaning over, that's why it was called a roofing, because it wasn't a completely horizontal wall. But a regular sukkah, which with horizontal walls, have nothing to do with schach, and therefore the attributes of schach do not apply to them, and we do not need that they should offer more shade than sunlight. Continues the Gemara. Omer Abaya. Abaya said that there were 8 Tanoim who all said the same thing. Rabbi Yashia, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Ubeis Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, V'acherim. They all said Kulhu Sfirulu. They all held Sukkah Diras Kva Ba'inon. A sukkah has to be able to be used in a permanent and fixed fashion. It's got to look and be perceived like a home, like a house, something fixed. Not like we saw earlier on that Sukkah Diras Arai, as we saw in Daf Beis. These opinions hold Sukkah Diras Kva, Sukkah has to be something fixed. And now the Gemara is going to go through these 8 Tanoim. Where do we know this from? Rebbe. Where do we know that Rebbe holds this way? The Tanya we learned in a Brisa, we saw this on Daf Gimel, Rebbe Omer kol sukkah she'ein ba arba amis al arba amis psula. Rebbe says the smaller sukkah can't just be 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim. It has to be 4 amis by 4 amis. That seems to tell us it needs to be a more permanent type of abode and not just a 7 by 7, which is clearly not a permanent type of dwelling place. That's Rebbe. Rabbi Yashia. Where do we see Rabbi Yashia says Sukkah Diras Kva? Hada Omron, like we saw before, Rabbi Ashia says that if the walls themselves allow more shade in, more light coming in, then the amount of shade they're offering is possible. So you see, you need a more permanent type of walls. Rabbi Yehuda, where do we see that Rabbi Yehuda says that the sukkah has to be a more permanent fixture? Ditnan, we learned in the Mishnah, on the beginning of the Perek on Daf Beis, sukkah she gavoya l'maylo me'esrim amma psula. According to the Tanna Kama, a sukkah whose schach is more than 20 ammas off the ground is possible. Rabbi Yehuda machshir, Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda holds it can even be a diras kva. It has to be able to also be a diras kva. Reb Shimon, where do we see that Reb Shimon holds a sukkah as diras kva? The Tanya we saw before in the Gemara, shtaim kilchason shlishas afilu tefach. The Tanna Kama say that a sukkah, just 2 walls plus a tefach is enough. Reb Shimon omer gimel kilchason or revius afilu tefach. Reb Shimon says you need to at least have a representation of 4 walls, not just 3 walls. So you see, it has to be more kavua. Rabbi Gamliel, where do we see that Rabbi Gamliel says it has to be a sukkah diras kva? The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. If somebody makes a sukkah on top of a wagon, on top of a carriage, or on top of a ship, and there the wind could easily blow them away because they're high up and they're exposed to the elements. Then Rabbi Gamliel says, Gamliel says, since the sukkahs could be moved out of place, it's possible. It's not permanent enough. Because Rabbi Gamliel says it has to be a sukkah diras kva. Rabbi Kiva machshir, Rabbi Kiva says it's kosher all the while that it's standing. There's no problem with it. Beis Shammai, where do we see Beis Shammai say sukkah diras kva? Ditnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Mi shahaya roishe v'rubai b'sukkah v'shulchone b'soich habayis. Beis Shammai holds, and we saw this before already when we were learning Daf Gimel, and to Mishnah later on, that if somebody is sitting inside the sukkah and is sitting at the table, but the actual table is inside the house, Beis Shammai say that it's possible. Why? Because if you haven't got the table in the sukkah, then you can't use it. You can't use the sukkah. It's not Latashmish is not worthy or it's not fit to be used. And that's lacking in its permanentness of that of the sukkah. Basil Machshir and Basil say it's okay. Rabbi Eliezer, where do we see Rabbi Eliezer hold sukkah diras kva? Ditnan, we learned in the Mishnah, ha'oises sukkah means thrif. If somebody makes a sukkah like a hut, which means that it's just a diagonal, just like walls which come to a point at the top. You haven't really got a clearly defined schach and walls, and the whole thing is made of material that could be kosher schach, but it's just like a hut. Or you took a schach material, anything that's kosher for schach, and you just leaned it against a wall, and underneath it, let's assume it's big enough for a sukkah. There you, again, don't have clearly defined schach, which is horizontal, and walls that are vertical. Rabbi Eliezer poisel. Rabbi Eliezer says it's possible, because you haven't got a horizontal roofing. And the Chachomim say that it's kosher. And Rashi, it says that ein noel adira. It's not comfortable to have a permanent type of dwelling when you haven't got a clearly defined roofing. So it must be that they hold, that Rabbi Eliezer holds that sukkah diras kva, and that's why it's possible. Acherim, finally the last opinion, where do we see that acherim means others? Where do we see they hold that sukkah has to be keva? The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, acherim oimrim sukkah ha'asuya k'shevach, a sukkah that's round, similar to a dovecote. Since it's round, psula, the fisher ein lazoviyes, it doesn't have corners. And the Ran explains that it's not common for a permanent type of home, a house, not to have corners. And since this has got no corners, acherim say it's possible. So you see that acherim say that the sukkah has to be diras kva. We'll learn later on in the Gemara there are those who argue this and say that even a round sukkah is kosher. But acherim hold it's possible because they say it has to be a diras kva. And the Mir Hashem in the next Gemara, in the next Shiur, we're going to continue from here.